think we're good to get rolling.
Okay, let's do it. All right, so thank you to everyone who is here today. And I'm sure some more people will be trickling in as we get started here. But today we are speaking with the Novak. Not my first time meeting him. He's an extremely smart guy. Most of you, if you were around in the 2021 bull market, would probably have heard of the ConstitutionDAO. It was a group that somehow came out of the shadows, raised 12,000 ETH in 3 days, $47 million at the time, and tried to buy an original copy of the Constitution. He was fully Nicolas Cage, national treasure out here.
Did our best, man.
And they came extremely close if it weren't for the one who shall not be named. But yeah, before that, he worked at 28th Street Ventures, about a $1 billion fund where he worked on software investing, some private equity, some structuring. And since then, is it fair to say that you've kind of transitioned completely to crypto now with the SALT funds?
Yeah.
Great. But you're also a partner at the SALT fund, which is now a crypto native fund.
Yep.
Correct.
Family
Great.
funds, and I'm a partner at the crypto fund.
Amazing. All right, so let's just get started. I've prepared some questions for him here. Pretty much the structure is going to be for the next 35 to 40 minutes. I'll be asking Graham some questions that we've come up with. And then the last 20 minutes will be completely free to you guys to open Q&A, asking whatever you want. Could be about things we've spoken about here, or it could be about anything and you choose to ask. Yeah, with that being said, let's just dive in. So many people here are obviously familiar with the ConstitutionDAO. Like we said, a group that came out of nowhere and just somehow raised $47 million, all within 72 hours. So before we dive into the DAO's mechanics, can you give kind of like a backstory of who was involved in this process, how this happened in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were a ton of people who actually helped towards the effort itself. The entire core team was over 20 people. I'd say there's really like 8 to 10 of us that were probably taking care of a vast majority of the work. But these are all folks who have full-time jobs as technologists, as investors, as entrepreneurs, both Web 2 and Web 3. But the way that a lot of this came together was like many things nowadays, very rapid. And obviously on the internet, Discord, Twitter served as kind of focal points for what we were doing. And actually, I grabbed a couple of screenshots and a couple of things that you guys might, if you want to share, enable screen sharing, I grabbed a couple of things you guys might want to see. It's kind of a fun part of the process. But the very initial onset of this was, truly ground roots. From actual inception of idea to full execution was, I cannot exaggerate this, literally 1 week. So the morning of October or November 11th, this was, I was at 20th Street Ventures office working on stuff. And at the time, doing some analysis on SPACs to take a company public that we'd invested in. Also on the side, doing research on DAOs. I'd been running our crypto portfolio, started our crypto investment practice. And so a lot of these ideas were kind of like all in my head at like roughly the same time. And then I get these series of text messages. So the first one was just a group chat. And these are like just some high school friends. This is literally as innocuous as it is. One of my friends who literally works at an auction house, her name's Allison, sends us the link and says, all right, who wants to buy me a Christmas present? This is like 10 in the morning. I start sending messages to my buddy Austin. We start sending messages to a bunch of people in the crypto sphere who I've met in different ways, shapes, and forms, and basically started telling everyone, we're going to launch a DAO, we're going to buy the Constitution. There's a kickoff call at 8 p.m. Either if you want to join. It just sounded just crazy enough. Now, the best part was, this is where it started. I didn't even get a chance to respond to them until 2 in the morning, after the Discord had been launched, after smart contract development had begun, and after I'd already had my first phone call with Sotheby's. So over the course of 1 day, this stuff had gone out of hand pretty dramatically. So literally it was a matter of, that morning started kind of recruiting core team members. I'm not sure if any of you guys read Packy McCormick's work, but we'd kind of crossed paths about a year earlier as he started writing, getting more and more active. It's been fun watching him take off. And I'd kind of told him, I said, we're going to be doing something crazy. Well, love for you to join it. I don't know if you guys know the folks over at Paradigm. They've got a really amazing set of investors over there. And so I just started shooting messages and saying, look, like I think that we're going to try to do something pretty crazy, right? All about the same time, send some messages to Sotheby's, try to get a sense of what are the legal requirements, what are the real challenges going to be involved with doing this. And this other picture on the right here is kind of infamous. This is from our very first kickoff call. Fortunately, I didn't get it at the beginning with everyone there. That's kind of a little bit as it's winding down. The guy here is my friend Austin, currently head of partnerships over at Polygon. And he was also in Atlanta with me at the time. At the time, also not at Polygon. But this is kind of where a lot of this origin story had started for us.
Yeah, it's amazing. And honestly, one of the most important things about ConstitutionDAO was how many people you guys actually got together.
Yeah.
So I think registered wallets was 17,000 crypto contributors.
Mm-hmm.
And again, all in 72 hours.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm kind of wondering, it feels like a lot of the times crypto Twitter, a lot of projects come out of nowhere and you see like a lot of likes and a lot of people retweeting. And you kind of wonder like how that came about from the shadows, what kind of goes on behind the scenes. So what were like some of the, I guess, marketing tricks that you guys were using to spread the word so fast? Because you guys had big people on board, but still it spread like wildfire in 72 hours.
Yeah, I think very, very counterintuitively, the fact that we had a forced timeline, we had a forced deadline, which was an auction that was going to happen in 1 week, was probably one of the greatest advantages we actually could have had, because at one way or the other, all this excitement was getting compressed down. If this had been long and drawn out over a 2-month period or 3-month period, I don't think that it all would have unfolded the same way. I think there would have been a lot more harsh criticism. There would have been, there could have been an adversarial approach with a, different group. There could have been a lot of things that happened. In 1 week, there was basically this sense of awe of there's no way, but could we? And just enough. I mean, also if you have to remind, right now, rewind, because right now, everyone's, at the trough of confidence. Everyone feels like garbage. This time, we probably actually marked a Pico top in the market, which I'm not necessarily proud of that part, but there was a sense of euphoria. I'll be the first to say, we captured lightning in the bottle. There was unique timing around this. It was a unique asset and a unique timing around all of these things. And so this is not necessarily hey, there's a clear formula and Graham's just going to spell it out and this is super replicable. And it's part of the reason why we haven't necessarily seen the same thing happen again and again. But there were a few very unique things about how we did it, which was actually largely from a necessity out of legal structuring. And the way we actually structured things ended up basically being how is it we can do this such that we are not violating security laws, such that we're allowing for the greatest number of participants, such that it's kind of an equal playing field, and there's basically no one put at a disadvantage here. And so we're really trying to lean into the actual ethos of what DAOs are and how the crypto ecosystem has evolved. But the necessity from a structuring standpoint meant you can't have a pre-sale, you can't have a token allocation. So there are functionally no insiders, aside from the fact that there's a core team that's operating and executing a lot of decisions very, very quickly, and necessity of time. And this is where you start getting a very interesting push and pull between the outward spoken communication of what is a DAO and how is a DAO supposed to function, flat, decentralized, all of these aspects, versus what's the actual reality of what has to happen when you have to make lots of decisions very rapidly. What is the legal structure in place? What is the smart contract we're going to use? Who is going to launch the website? These are all decisions that individual people have to make. And you don't have time to make a, organization-wide token-based vote, let alone if there's not even a token yet. So this is where we start getting into the nitty-gritty nuance, where the rubber meets the road of how challenging is it to actually coordinate a group of people. And this is something that the entire crypto ecosystem has continued to struggle with, which is what does a good governance structure look like? How do you actually have token-based governance? It's brought up great conversations around, the importance and the intrigue behind Sybil resistant one person, one base voting or quadratic voting and some of these other interesting mechanisms. And for us, this was, particularly prescient because the document that we were actually buying as a DAO was none other than the Constitution. So from a very meta aspect, if you take a step back and really think about what's happening, was a group who's pushing the cutting edge of what can we do with electronic governance, with human governance, being able to interact with this historic document that, in my mind, is up to this point the greatest document of kind of human social coordination history so far. That's, you know, had amazing durability and longevity and robustness, and actually be able to like to interact with that piece. And so it's funny because like all these conversations kind of come out at the same time. And I'll also be the first to say, I mean, we launched this whole thing without a governance structure in place, almost the deepest part of irony of the whole thing. And there's lots of things obviously we do differently. And you know, in 1 week's time, there's only so much you can do. And it's all kind of a part of it.
Yeah, so a big issue with DAOs, like you just said, is what kind of governance structures are in place and how can you avoid, you know, the people with the highest concentration of tokens from overpowering or reaching some sort of Pareto's law where certain people have asymmetric power over the others in the group. Obviously, I know you guys did not ever decide on the governance structure of ConstitutionDAO. That was going to be like, we buy it first and then we'll figure it out. But I assume you guys had some conversations about what would have happened. So what, can you comment a bit about, you know, the governance models that you were considering and like potential issues you saw with each of them?
Yeah. So the approach we were going to take, even from the onset, was going to be approach of gradual decentralization, which I still maintain would have been the natural course of action. How it necessarily evolved, though, was there's kind of a junction point, which is if win Constitution, begin gradual decentralization. If fail, wind down. And if you go the course of winding down, decentralizing to start with just doesn't actually make sense. And from a legality standpoint, because there is money locked in a smart contract, us choosing to reallocate it or pushing to have that money reallocated could have caused problems from a legality standpoint. So the only fiscally responsible thing that we could have done at that point was to say, look, like we're going to wind down the organization. We're going to be, thoughtful with consumer money, put money back in the smart contract, allow for refunds at the same rate at which they put in money. So just trying to do the very ethical and responsible thing. The ideal route is, if we acquire it, let's begin taking gradual steps of decentralization. In my mind, an optimal structure is closely, especially for this type of organization. Again, you can't generalize structures for all organizations. A group that has more operational pieces and has more complexity and more parts is going to look very different than a totally, autonomous chunk of code that really doesn't require any additional, effort or input or maintenance. And that's also very different from, some type of, collective that might have lots of real world assets or real world operations. So all these things act and operate differently. But for the specific case of the Constitution, we were very interested in having like a one person, one vote type structure, which now introduced challenges of civil resistance. So now the next best solution you can wind up at is something kind of in between, one person, one vote and token weighted voting, which I'd say are kind of two different ends of the spectrum, which is something called quadratic voting. And quadratic voting basically is just a function that says we're going to decrease the overall voting power of basically the largest token holders. So if you hold 100 tokens, you only have 10 voting power. If you have 25 tokens, you've got 5 voting power. And that's kind of this, how the rough function works. And so it basically pushes an organization away from what we describe as a plutocratic structure, one that concentrates itself around kind of wealth and ownership, and says we're going to focus it on a broader base and a greater distribution. And the whole concept behind allowing people to own the document, allowing the people to govern the document, very much so kind of alluded to that. And so that's why we wanted the structure to reflect it.
Great. Yeah, it's definitely an ongoing conversation to have about DAOs.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to focus on, which is kind of like you guys were really, really good at storytelling throughout this entire process.
Yeah.
National Treasure bringing in Nicolas Cage, We Are the People kind of narrative. So kind of when you get to the Sotheby's auction, you're watching the amount of crowd pool funds go from 23 million. All of a sudden you get up to 47 million and there's a real shot at this. So when you step into the room at Sotheby's, at the auction, you're surrounded by all these multimillionaires, these TradFi guys. How did it feel being like a crypto DAO representing the crypto space in a room full of all these guys who may or may not hate you?
There's definitely a sense of being underdogs, right? Actually, our approach, we got invited to go to the actual auction itself but they basically said, hey, look, there's only like 3 or 4 spots for you guys to go. And we're like, well, in the core team alone, there's a whole bunch of us, and the organization is much bigger than that. So we actually kind of took a little bit of a rejection approach. We said, we're going to go do our own thing. We had our own watch party. There was dozens and dozens of people in this room. It was a lot of the core team, a lot of friends, a lot of people who had been in servers and things like that. And it was in New York City, just a couple blocks away from where the auction was happening. And so Robbie, who ultimately was actually on the other line of the phone, and again, we can talk about the structuring at some point. He is from Endowment, who is the 501c3 fiscal sponsor of the nonprofit that actually collected the money officially. He's sitting there on the other side of this phone, and so obviously, what everyone else is seeing play out is this hilarious, debate between Brooke on one side and the other gentleman who, of course, inevitably was actually the one bidding on our half, David Schrader, and Sotheby's, they call him Schrader the Trader. And so we actually, not even the whole core team knew. A very small number of us actually knew who the actual bidder was. Sotheby's had given us very clear, explicit directions. Do not share, do not communicate who your bidder is. And it actually would be against the guidelines and rules to communicate, or based off of like the rules just Sotheby's has as house rules. And so we didn't communicate with our own team. And this is what caused a lot of confusion immediately after the auction as well. But there is something very bizarre about knowing that you're going up against a very small handful of people who could possibly be bidding tens of millions of dollars on an asset. Preemptively, we actually did a fair bit of legwork to contact people who are the very known brokers of fine, expensive Americana, to understand who's participating in this, what are you hearing, and can we actually have a chance to communicate with them? We'd love to tell them about what we're doing and compel them as to why this is a thoughtful, equally democratic approach. It's actually respecting the ideology of the Constitution. That this is actually a very thoughtful process. This isn't just what you're hearing in the news and media. And we know that there's at least one high-profile person, a previous owner of a multi-million-dollar Magna Carta, multi-billionaire, a gentleman named David Rubenstein, actually ended up choosing to bow out of the auction. Now, we couldn't get to everyone. We didn't talk to everyone. So we actually didn't even know Ken Griffin was participating in the auction until the fateful day after, when everyone just thought, this is crazy. It couldn't have been Ken Griffin. Couldn't have.
Yeah, that's something else. The one who shall not be named. That guy is an enemy of crypto since the beginning.
But one other thing, actually, Gabriel, I did want to mention was this idea about like why was it that we're doing it? I told you a little bit some of my personal reasons about actually having this like fun respect for the Constitution and being able to interact with it in a way that's almost paying homage to it, but also extrapolating and saying what's next, what's on the cutting edge. But I want to share a couple of things that were actually posted to the ConstitutionDAO page, and I think you guys can see this now. But this is something that, like, honestly, was really, really moving to me. These are just a couple of screenshots that I was going to overlaid. So these are actual comments from people who contributed money and left their commentary. And so there was lots and lots of interpretations about why this project is meaningful and powerful. And some people, it was about them and their families having immigrated to the United States and having the Constitution for them represent freedom and democracy. For other people, it was about the evolution of this originally flawed document, a document that has needed to evolve over time, that has needed to grow and evolve with democracy, that had fundamental flaws. For other people, it was about the engaging into Web3. For some people, it was about just doing something cool. For some people, it was about sticking it to the man and saying that, like, people should be able to own this important historic document. So there was dozens and dozens of ways that people went about interpreting it, and there's just a handful of them.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of decentralizing the ownership of, like you said, one of the most important documents in the history of the world, let alone the United States, is very powerful and it kind of a testament to those people who really believe in the future of crypto and decentralization. Lastly, about the ConstitutionDAO, before we move on to other parts of your expertise, what lessons should young builders and entrepreneurs take away from the entire experience that you had?
Yeah, there's really a handful of things here, and one is, like, I think what's really important to know is, I think lots of people think that there's like a very highly prescribed path towards like building something fun or big or interesting or unique, and there's not really a prescribed path. Like, I wish I could give you a formula, but it's a combination of like pursuing lots and lots of interests and not like feeling bad about them, not feeling like, oh, I have to pursue this because this is hot, or this is trendy, or this is a, sexy vertical, or everyone's talking about this particular thing. When you find your thing, dive into it, learn tons about it, but also be willing to have like different types of interests. One of the things that was, I think, really compelling and really, helpful for me personally in the starting of this was like, I spent time, like, I mean, as a technological, Web2 founder, as a technologist, but also as a crypto investor. And I spent time actually then in traditional finance as well, doing structured deals and structured financing. And it was actually like the convergence of all of these things, and me being at least a little bit of like history geek as well. It was like the convergence of all these things that said like, oh, like I could see how this plays into this, that like, oh, like this, there's actually something here that if we were begin pushing it, that there's something that would click. And if you only, are listening to the same echo chamber of people, or you don't, reach outside of that, then it's really hard to like draw on those shared inspirations. And so like part of it is like, this is funny because like in some ways this represents this battle between like the Democratic people and like TradFi, Ken Griffin, almost like the epitome of it. But the actual structure that we used, fundamentally the actual design of it, where we enable people to contribute Ether in exchange for tokens that at the very end of this are redeemable at the exact same redemption rate. Different numbers, different assets, different platforms, different timing, but from a mechanics standpoint, and the mechanics of how it functioned is actually identical to how SPACs are formed and raised. And so when I think about what was I doing in my professional life, what was it that I was spending my time on doing before that? It was actually analyzing how did these SPAC mechanics work. So there's these borrowing of ideas and then being able to see, oh, there's a great protocol that we could use and implement here. What we did wasn't technologically revolutionary. And there's a lot of people who are doing just amazing things at the cutting edge of technology. This is a case of being able to implement it in a thoughtful way that like hadn't quite been done before. The other thing is like stuff's always going to like evolve in like ways that like, you don't really expect. So like I didn't expect like half of the stuff post facto to happen. Like we didn't expect the token to turn to a meme coin. We didn't expect it to be Ken Griffin. We didn't expect the whole thing to end up getting political. We didn't expect like a lot of these things, but you have to just like roll with it, when stuff happens and when stuff arises. And so I'd say those are the big things. And so if you're interested in like doing entrepreneurial stuff, like more than anything, it's like, go do it. Like just absolutely go do it. There's almost no instance that I've witnessed for people, historically speaking, who've thought about doing something entrepreneurial, who are worse off or wish they'd taken the kind of safer or more traditional approach. So like take calculated, thoughtful, healthy risks. Definitely the recommendation.
Great. The first thing you said is very interesting, and I do want to expand on that. Do you think that perhaps in crypto, people who want to build in crypto sometimes focus too much on only the specifics within the crypto sector and don't take the time, or maybe they just, because of the philosophy of crypto, they reject TradFi, they reject all these other outside domains of knowledge. And in some ways they try to, reinvent technologies in the crypto space when there's so much to be learned from the world that existed millions, if not thousands of decades before Bitcoin was ever even invented. Would you say that's something that exists?
Yeah. As much as I love the ecosystem and I actively participate in it and have so many friends and so many colleagues that are so deeply ingrained in it, I have a lot of respect for them. We also around ourselves have created a tremendous echo chamber that tends to reflect the same types of ideas. And as innovative as the industry is, it still is actually a very small number of people who are actually truly saying, let me introduce a brand new mechanism, a brand new contract. Real innovation, like actually introducing novel things is very hard. But the way that you combine them and the way that you add these Lego pieces is going to be unpopular when you suggest a different way, especially if it's contrary to like the absolute main advice. And I think the thing I'd like probably challenge people on is like, if you agree with 100% of the opinions of 100% of, or like the general consensus on like most crypto ideas, you're probably not spending enough time outside of the sphere. And so like, right. And I'll be happy to share some of these things with you. I think there's a lot of things that the crypto industry like still has wrong, or that we've made false assumptions about, or we've tried to apply a right idea in a lot of wrong ways. Like, for example, decentralization at the base layer of like, let's talk about like Ethereum, for example, right? Having a decentralized base layer to the network is an extremely powerful, extremely important and necessary concept. And the big picture ideology behind that about what that does to durability, what that does for security, what this does for censorship resistance, what this does to create a layer that is genuinely credibly neutral, incredibly powerful. But then a lot of organizations, ourselves included, many other DAOs included, said, oh, decentralized, good. So we're going to decentralize everything. We're going to decentralize decision-making. We're going to decentralize this. And so we've had to learn the same things that all of history has learned many, many times over, which is, okay, like the reason why we delegated powers to these people was because they were spending a disproportionate amount of time and energy and effort. And because they're spending a lot of time, energy, and effort, they actually might know better than just Joe Schmo who happened to log on the Discord server 5 minutes ago. It doesn't know the nuance between these things. So there actually is, thoughtful ideas behind these things. So the idea is like latch on to like the really actually important part of these things. So for me, what a lot of this stuff comes down to, for example, is like programmatic accountability is like a really fascinating concept. It's not necessarily how we describe it. It's not how we always program it. But to me, that is like a really powerful tool. But there's lots of ways that like we wind up in this kind of ideological echo chamber and then just kind of like, kind of regurgitating some of the same ideas. I had one of the most sobering, thoughtful conversations yesterday. He was the general counsel of a large layer 2 scaling solution that you guys are all certainly familiar with. And he himself is a crypto skeptic. And it's amazing to me that he's, as active with them as he is. And he sat there and gave me all the reasons why crypto will fail. And it's challenging to hear those things, but so wildly important when you do hear them to lean into it and to listen and to incorporate that into your thought process. Because if you only hear people who are constantly telling you, that's great, it's awesome, this is good, there's nothing wrong with it, then there's just gonna be so much disappointment later on. And you want people who are constantly poking holes in it. So like I seek the people who are like, that's a terrible idea. And I'm like, okay, like that's interesting, tell me more. Like tell me more. And if it's a really thoughtful, educated perspective, I absolutely love to hear it. And so I think those opinions that like we really have to lean into more in the industry. And that includes from TradFi, that includes from Web 2. Hell, I mean, I'll give you a great example. I imagine you guys probably have heard of Farcaster by this point. Lens and Farcaster are probably two of the more interesting attempts in the social sphere. Farcaster was largely from a lot of Web 2 people who said, decentralization is great and the approach is great, but like maybe we've taken it a little bit too far. Maybe it's actually not a decentralization of the data on chain. Maybe it just needs to be like how we're actually replicating the data in actual web nodes and duplicating that in a way that allows for multiple people to build multiple front-end interfaces on it. And that's a different way of decentralizing. So it's basically recombining these ideologies in ways that you might not expect. Gabriel, I think you might have paused on me, or I paused for everybody else. Let's see if turning off my video helps. Can everyone else hear me? Or is it just Gabriel that's paused?
I can definitely hear you. I think it was just Gabriel.
Sweet. Cool. I will actually maybe just go ahead and turn it over to you guys if there's another question. Actually, there's only one other thing I like actually really wanted to share about. I think what was important to project to me that I think just probably means an awful lot. It's probably worth sharing. Let me go ahead and share this with you. So if you can see that, so this to me was honestly like if you said like pros, cons, good, bad, anything of like what happened out of ConstitutionDAO. To me, this was like the best single thing, which was, okay, didn't win the Constitution, that's fine. Afterwards, there was just this massive like just explosion of people saying, wow, I can see what could happen when we coordinate a lot of people really rapidly. What if we tried it this way? What if we tried it that way? And there was a lot of different ideas and a lot of different approaches. And so all of a sudden, you hit November 2021 and boom, you had all these new on-chain activities happening, all kinds of new governance activities, lots of snapshot votes, lots of new attempts in different ways. And to me, like, that's kind of how it is. And so when people post facto are asking, they're like, does it like weird DAO would like offend you that like people are like taking the idea, ripping it, or doing this other thing. I'm like, no, that's like literally how this industry is like designed. It's literally how it's optimized, is like allowing for people to take ideas, reformat them, take these same pieces, and then re-implement in different ways. And that's the power of a lot of this.
All right, I'm back. So I got rugged. We're back. All right, with that, interesting. I cut off with Farcaster. We're having Dan Romero next month. So
oh, excellent. I'm glad to hear. So again, Dan will be able to give you a great example about kind of this balance of, hey, maybe putting all data on chain is one approach. And I can't tell you, I'm not here to say that Dan's got the right approach, Lens has got the right approach, or one or the other, but they're different. And it's good to have different approaches. And I think it's awesome.
Definitely. Okay. And with that, Graham, do you want to just go into Q&A, given the timing?
That sounds awesome. I'm up for it.
Let's do it. All right, guys. So if you have any questions, just raise your hands and we'd be happy to bring you on stage. Let's see. All right, Zach.
Awesome. Hello. Thank you, Graham. And thank you for, I guess, what you've done for like the DAO community and the greater space as a whole. I guess I wanted to hear your input on what you thought about DAO tooling and what tools you think have potential, and like kind of like what you're seeing and your overall opinion in that space at the moment.
Yeah, great question. Great question. This is another one where there's maybe been a little bit of echo chambering, in my opinion. And by that, I mean like DAO tooling, very, very necessary, because you have to have basic functionality of interacting with your peers, with your colleagues, of being able to assign responsibility and actually establish basic governance structures. I think one of the things that the community made a mistake about, though, was basically saying, okay, we've had some DAOs, and the ones that were the biggest or had the most money, those are the models that we're going to base stuff off of. So we started building a bunch of tools really rapidly, saying, all right, ConstitutionDAO raised money this way, so we're going to build tools that look and feel just like someone wants to do ConstitutionDAO again. When in reality, that might not actually be the optimal skill set, or it might not be the optimal set of tools to build. We certainly didn't have a governance model worth emulating, worth echoing. So first, I'd say anytime you hear a DAO professional saying, oh, let me tell you, what the how DAOs should be, or what's wrong, or what the right DAO model is, I just get the big red flags in my head. I'm like, that doesn't, I haven't, there's very few groups that I say, oh, they've got no room for improvement. So like, for example, in my head, like who are like the absolute, most successful DAOs out there? I would make an argument. ENS has done an excellent job. I would say that MakerDAO has done an excellent job. Uniswap in its own rights has done an excellent job, but there's nuances and there's still struggles. And I mean, I know a lot of team at Maker quite well, and they still struggle with, how they establish governance and what it does to bog down their organization and what it prevents them from doing sometimes. So there's a lot of struggles. So if I flip over to tools, it's like, okay, what are the quintessential things that are really needed that are helpful in this space? Well, it's allowing to have different types of governance structures. By governance structures, I mean, can you basically have these Lego blocks that allow you to allocate capital, make decisions, and delegate responsibilities? So a lot of tools related to token gating, I think, are important. And token gating can apply to assets, but it can also apply to things like administrative tools. So we're slowly, different tools like Lit Protocol are kind of recreating what I describe as like the Okta of Web3, where it's like these tiered hierarchical permissioning trees. So you can still have someone say, okay, like I'm the administrator for this, the website, for example, and I can permission in other people to, push commits to GitHub, or allow this person to have token gated access to the admin account for Zoom, or for Google Links, or for any of these types of things. So all those things can actually exist on chain, and you can assign permissions. So I think that this whole idea of token gating and like permissioning that correlates to Web 2 assets, or Web 2 like tools, is definitely going to continue to blow up. And I think that's quite interesting. And I think that the kind of fine-grained modularity of like, how do we just like actually thoughtfully as an organization on chain spend money. When I say on-chain organization, I say that because like not everything's going to be a DAO, right? There's going to be some stuff like looks and feels just like more like a company. And again, that's okay. Not everything has to be totally flat. But the question is like, how do we just like make sure that like someone's not like, stealing money? How do we make sure they aren't, just like, self-benefiting? How do we make sure that they're actually, being good, consistent actors? So can we build tools that actually, contribute to accountability? I think another thing that the space has gotten obsessed with is that, everything has to exist outside of the eyes of the law, or everything has to be unregistered. Bitcoin in its state and trajectory is not going to have to ever be a registered security. Ethereum in its trajectory is never going to have to be a registered security. But the vast majority of things that ever have any type of, equity like aspect to them, any semblance of claimed assets, any semblance of cash flow, those are going to start acting and feeling like equities. And those are probably eventually going to be, viewed, with a very skeptical eye by the SEC. And so what does that mean? If we know it's going to happen, let's be pragmatic about it. Let's start providing an option for people to be compliant from the onset. Let's allow them to start mirroring real world corporate structures so that when I have a multi-sig with multiple multi-sig signers, those multi-sig signers also are automatically corresponding to the board members of my LLC. And if I remove a multi-sig member with an on-chain vote, oh, what if we just automatically file the LLC document that corresponds to, oh, we removed a board member? So those types of things, I think, to me, are very fascinating. How do we make the existing system work for what we want to happen in our ideal on-chain system?
Thanks, Graham. I think Gabe's headphones and audio is not working right now, so I'm going to take over the Q&A session. I think it's been a good amount of discussion here so far, so I'm going to take questions now. We have one from Emily. Go ahead, Emily.
Thanks, Gio. Hi, Graham. Thank you so much for coming. I thought that you were super inspirational, and I was just curious that if we wanted to like get in further contact after this, do you have like a preferred method of contact or?
Yeah, I'll put a couple links in the messages down here. I'm usually fairly responsive on Twitter and Telegram are kind of my main things. So I'll send them down there for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure thing.
Any more questions? Go ahead, Matt.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for hosting this, and Graham, thanks for coming. I just had a quick question. As just like a developer in the Web3 space, what I guess insights or recommendations do you have for developers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I will give you my strong opinionated stance because I think a lot of people will give waffly answers and sometimes struggle with it a little bit. I've got a pretty strong personal bias and preference towards the Ethereum ecosystem. I got a pretty strong bias towards basically anything that's EVM compatible and would probably push people in that direction. Not because I don't think there's interesting stuff happening. I think some of the new Move languages are fascinating. I think some of the Rust-based and Solana stuff is also great. But if you were just asking me like my personal opinion, I'd say like going where there's a hyper large critical mass of other talent and other developers is really useful, and so that's probably the direction I point you. The other thing is like it kind of depends, I suppose, like where you're at kind of in the evolution cycle, but more than anything is like go find a project that you feel like is way out of your league. Go find something that you think is way too tough for you to handle, and then just start. It's like the way that you would eat a whale, right? It's one bite at a time, very, very slow and methodically, but start with like really aspirational things. I think some of the projects, sometimes people say like, oh, start with this very basic AMM contract. It's kind of the same ones people repeat again and again. There's something very educational about tackling something really big and challenging that makes you really understand the nitty-gritty nuances of how smart contracts really function.
Great. Thank you so much.
Totally. I'm going to go ahead and read this question from Benjamin here. Thanks for taking the time, Graham, to speak with us today. Thoughts on DAO employment? As DAO treasuries and operations grow, hiring needs will increase. What do you think are the most important aspects and components of DAO employment? What is unique about employment, DAO employment, or hiring needs? This is a problem in space. It's a huge problem in space. There's a fair number of kind of, I'd say, third-party organizations who are trying to make it easier by allowing DAOs to pay people through either traditional means or for automatically filing the legal paperwork. But for you as individuals, I just say, like, just make sure that you're being compliant. In most cases, you're probably going to fall into a class of being an independent contractor. And a lot of things that they don't tell you after you become an independent contractor is that there are like legal ramifications of that. And independent contractors don't have their payments automatically taken out of their paycheck. And you also are obligated to pay these kind of like quarterly estimations each year. And so what I've seen a fair number of people do is like they'll make a whole decent chunk of money through the year. They get to the end of the year and they're like, all right, got to go pay taxes, realize that none of it's been deducted. And now they owe a decent chunk of what they made over the last year, but having spent most of it, and they find themselves in a tough situation. So that's just one thing I might, warn against. But I'd say, like, treat DAO employment in some ways still somewhat similar to the way that you think about regular employment. Do you have like a good contract? Now, in the crypto world, maybe that contract is eventually going to be a smart contract. That's fascinating. We haven't really seen many employment smart contracts yet. I hope we do. Throw that in the category of DAO tooling I want to see. But if you're, being employed by like a large organization, something like, a Polygon, for example, they're going to give you an actual, employment contract. Treat it like a regular job in company. If it's a smaller DAO, just be aware these are volatile organizations. They are impermanent organizations. They will not last forever. And I think it's really easy for some organizations to act to, sometimes maliciously, sometimes unintendedly, overpromise to people. And I'd say, like, always take a step back and be like, is this realistic? What if this went down 90% tomorrow? And there's a lot of people who've agreed to take token-based compensation and have bet a lot of their personal livelihood on something. And then, when the token disappears or there's a hack or an exploit or just a bear market, this person loses a vast majority of their livelihood. Is that A, be willing to take money off the table, be willing to cash out as you go. You don't have to be 100% committed, 100% exposed all the time, but also B, just be very, very thoughtful about, these things are impermanent. And if this disappears tomorrow, like, have a thoughtful backup plan.
Right, Matthew, did you ask your question already? I see your hands up.
Oh yeah, sorry, I did.
Oh, good.
Hey, Graham.
Same.
I had a question actually myself. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the legal and regulatory landscape that kind of came up when you were doing ConstitutionDAO, and what the current landscape is for dealings with the government in crypto and DAO specifically, and where you think it's going in the future. I know it's a big loaded question, but I wanted to see if you had more deep insights on that.
It's a really good question. The actual regulatory landscape hasn't actually changed that much since ConstitutionDAO. One myth that I do want to dispel, and it's pretty regularly repeated, even by people who I really respect and like an awful lot, is that there is no legal clarity. There is no legal regulation. There is. It's bad. It's inefficient, but there is actual legal clarity, and it's what's causing people to do a lot of these funny structures and to have just governance tokens and causing people to create offshore entities. And I think that we're causing and perpetuating a lot of our own challenges. The big overarching stance on from like a regulatory standpoint right now is, though, if you launch a token, and that token meets certain types of criteria. So it could be something as simple as you've had a pre-sale to other individuals, you've promised some semblance of profit. There's all kinds of boxes that could check. It could be viewed as a security, and that could be viewed as doing something illegal. And security law is probably the biggest aspect of where there is strife and conflict and challenge. If I were to put my finger on particular where a lot of the issues come into play, or like where issues could disappear with. So like I for a long time started going down the rabbit hole of like why don't we actually just register these things as securities? Like if that's what has to happen, it's like a multi-million-dollar annual ongoing expense to have a registered security because of the tax, compliance, audit, overhead. And there's also certain types of actual mechanical friction associated with it. So for example, if I have a legal security, like when you guys have a stock sitting in your Robinhood or TD Ameritrade or Fidelity account, that stock is actually being custodied by a bank somewhere. And it's probably a handful of banks, but that's a legal requirement to be custodied by a bank. In the paradigm that we're introducing, it's not custodied by a bank. And that's the whole idea of it, is that you get to custody it, and I get to custody it, and I can actually own that with my own keys. And that's fundamentally opposed to some of the things that are allowed by public security. So we've created some of these own dilemmas with ourselves. There is clarity, it's just bad clarity. I think some of the things that we're going to see in the near future, unfortunately, we're probably not going to get clarity on the security side soon. You can expect probably legislation around stable coins. You can probably expect more strictness around algorithmic stable coins. You can probably actually expect an embrace in some senses of fully backed, audited, transparent stable coins. Things are more like USDC, probably less so like Terra Luna's whole debacle. But the regulatory landscape is definitely challenging. The thing that I remind people about regularly is like, there's a lot of things that people do in the ecosystem that like are technically in gray area, or there might be uncertainty about, or you could actually point to some cases of like, hey, this is technically breaking this law. What regulators really think about and what they really care about is, are you harming consumers? Are you doing something like legitimately harmful? Are you giving an unfair advantage or disadvantage to other people? So doing things like, pre-mints followed by pump and dumps, that's like objectively morally wrong and also definitively illegal. And those types of things would be pursued. And so when you start entering into a territory that's maybe potentially unclear, taking the high road from an ethics standpoint is incredibly, incredibly helpful. So for example, with ConstitutionDAO, there was different routes or possibilities that, for example, the core team could have profited immensely, but it also would have been potentially or probably illegal. And it wasn't worthwhile. Also wasn't like what we were interested in doing. So the way we structured it was with a nonprofit, and people contributed money by donating to a nonprofit, and they received governance of this nonprofit. Now that does restrict us. That means that us as an organization, that money we receive, that can never, ever be distributed as a profit, as a dividend. If we grow those assets in any capacity, that can't be redistributed in a profitable fashion. Now, that person who has a share of governance of that organization, that governance and that piece of ownership happen to then on secondary markets go up in price. And this is where you start entering a gray territory, right? And this gets into a very weird space where there's not a reason for it. There's not an explanation for it, but things like this do happen. And so from a legal standpoint, when we went back and talked to lawyers post facto, all of them were like, look, this was great. Like, you guys didn't have any inside sales. You didn't try to capture any token value. If any of you wanted to participate, you had to do it the same way that literally everyone else did. You didn't have a guarded whitelist around it. So by taking like a completely open and thoughtful process that like wasn't exclusive and was entirely open, and then doing the proper things, which was, okay, take the money back from the bank account that we had to establish for Sotheby's, put it back into the smart contract escrow, and allow people to take their refunds whenever. And we made this other choice, right? We're going to throw away the keys to the contract. We can't, like today, like even if our core team wanted to, we cannot touch the assets in that smart contract. The only thing people can do today is go get the redemptions. If you go buy a people token right now, you can go redeem it for Ethereum. Now, there's not a game theoretic incentive for people to do that because of the price of the token, and that's its own weird conversation. But the reason why we did that way is because like that's the right thing to do. So I'd say like when in doubt, when you guys are thinking about this stuff, like do gut checks with yourself, do gut checks with your friends and family who are outside of crypto, and be like, does this sound right to you? Is this like a right thing? But most importantly, listen to lawyers. There's a lot of smart lawyers out there, and I spend a lot of time talking to them.
Awesome. So yeah, I do want to be cognizant of the time. We have about 2 minutes left here. I do want to ask you one more thing, if you have time for it.
Sure
Could you
thing.
steel man the case for why tokens like Ethereum should be securities?
For why tokens like Ethereum should be securities?
Yeah.
So I don't think Ethereum should be a security. So if you give me a different token, I can steel man it. I don't think Ethereum should be, though.
Okay, a token of your choosing.
Okay. Well, let's use something like Uniswap. Uniswap as a governance token in its current state is probably not a security. Uniswap in its eventual state, let's hypothetically say that the best case scenario for Uniswap happens. Let's say Uniswap captures 100% of the market, and every single swap and exchange is simply on Uniswap v7, and every single liquidity pool exists just on Uniswap. And at some point, that's where every single ounce of any exchange is ever happening. And then Uniswap says, well, I mean, we've done it. We've captured the market. We're at full scale. And we might as well start, returning money to token holders. We're going to turn on our, 0.5% fee, and any fees that accrue to the protocol are going to start getting distributed. That is definitively, ostensibly, definitely, functions like a security. So the question is, like, we're dealing in this weird world where there's things that at some point might not be security. So Uniswap right now probably is not. As soon as they turn it on, though, from like a legal standpoint, not like what I want it to be. Would I want it to be functioning as a security? No, it's a pain in the butt. There's lots of problems with it, right? But like functioning, as soon as you turn on those fees, it's definitively like I just couldn't make an argument against it. Like if you go look at the law, right? It's the promise or guarantee of distribution of assets definitely checks a box for being a security, or the promise of profitability. And so all of a sudden you now have a cash flowing asset. You're essentially receiving a dividend the way you might if you were like holding a stock. So it is tricky when you have these things that could be or might not be. The reason why I think it's actually good to lean into like, hey, some of these things might be securities, like let's actually just treat them like it is. It actually like allows token holders to stop getting like screwed over. I think there's so many token holders who have been screwed royally and are going to continuously get screwed over royalty because of the ambiguity, and because we just have governance with these votes but not actual ownership. I'm already seeing these companies that basically formed, that they raised money on an equity stack. They released a token. All these token owners bought it. And they said, wow, this is awesome. We own this protocol or this thing. And now that this company has sold down a vast majority of their tokens, and they've still got a vast majority of their equity, though, that company's going, wait a second, we've got an ability to channel the profitability and the revenue from this protocol to our company instead of the tokens. And since we sold most of our tokens, and we already put that money on our balance sheet, and we've already hired a bunch of teams around it, that money's already spent, why wouldn't we just accrue the money to our equity, as opposed, like, why would we give the money to the token holders? And so because they have no legal obligation to do it, there's gonna be a bunch of token holders at some point are just like, wait a second, so I actually don't own anything. And that's going to be the case. And this is going to take a long time to see this play out. But there are going to be a lot of instances where, people joke around like, oh, what are these tokens actually worth? Some of them are actually going to be worthless, even if the protocol is wildly successful. Value accumulation and protocol success are not always going to be the same thing.
That's a great response. And with that, I think we have run out of time. Once again, Graham, I want to thank you so much for coming. And this is my second time talking to you, but you amaze me every time. You got a big brain on you. But, thanks again, man. Hopefully we can do this again, perhaps with a 2023 conference or something like that. That'd be awesome.
Sure thing, guys. You guys have my contact information in the chat, and Gabriel, if you want to send that to folks in any other capacity or whatever, you're welcome to. If you guys are working on projects, if you want to get my thoughts, I have a soft spot and for anyone who's building stuff, who are interested in getting advice. I really would be happy to help. So great meeting you. Thanks for having me, guys.
Tremendous. All right, thank you, everyone. We'll upload this later. Thanks, Graham.
Bye-bye.
See you.